Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And in this lesson, we are going to talk about chemical bonds. So, in last lesson, in section 2.1, we learned about different elements, learned about atoms and electrons, especially the importance why valence shell is important. Now, in this section 2.2, chapter 2, 2.2. So we will build directly on that foundation. Okay? So take note that atoms do not usually exist alone, but instead they interact with one another to form what we call as chemical bonds. And these chemical bonds are what allows the atoms to combine into molecules, into different compounds. And without chemical bonds, life would not exist. So in this section, the objective for this section is to focus on the four major types of chemical bonding interactions, which are ionic bonds, non-polar covalent bonds, polar covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. So each one of them plays a critical role in the structure and the function of the human body. So let's start our lesson with ionic bonds. So let's begin. So an ionic bond forms when an electrons are transferred from one atom to another. So for example, this. So this is sodium atom. This is a chlorine atom, and the sodium atom. Um, we have an electron here that has been transferred into here. So when an electron is transferred to one atom to another, that is called an ionic bond. And this happens when one atom has nearly an empty valence shell and one atom has a full valence shell. So as what you can see in this example here. So as you can see here, we have this. So this is the valence elect valence shell rather. This is the valence shell, as what you can see right here. And as you can see, there's only one. So it tends that this atom is wants to move into the another. I mean, this electron wants to move into another atom electron because as you can see, this valence shell is nearly full. The full valence shell is 8 here. Now, when this is moved, they are now bonded together. That's why we have sodium chlorine or table salt. So yeah, one atom has nearly empty valence shell and one atom has nearly full valence shell. That's why they bonded together with this single atom. And now, when an atom loses an electron, so as you can see, it loses here, it becomes a cation, meaning it has a positive charge. Carries a positive charge there, as you can see here. This is Na plus. And when an atom gains an electron, which is right here, it gains an electron from the sodium atom, it becomes an anion, meaning it carries a negative charge. And since opposite charges attract, the cation and the anion are held together by an electrical attraction. And this attraction is what we call the ionic bonds. So this is an example, sodium chloride. Sodium has one electron on its valence shell, and it's ready to give up. And so chlorine has 7 valence shell. So chlorine needs one more electron to become more stable, as we stated in the last video. And sodium loses an electron, becomes Na plus. Chlorine gains an electron, becomes Cl minus. And they form an ionic bond. So it's important to understand that ionic bonds are not true sharing bonds, but instead they are purely on electrical attraction between charged particles. So in our body, let's talk about it on medical side. In our body, our bonds are extremely important because many substances exist as ions. We have sodium or Na plus ion. We have the potassium K plus ion. In bananas, we also have the calcium ion or Ca2 plus ion. We also have chloride, Cl minus. And these ions are essential for muscle contraction, for fluid balance, for the rhythm of the heart. The heart keeps beating, for nerve impulses, so we can identify the touch in our skin. And ionic compounds are often form crystals. For example, this sodium chloride or salt. But in the body, they typically dissociate with water, meaning that the ions separate and move freely. So this property makes ionic bonds important for sociological processes. Next, we have covalent bonds, but it has two types, which are nonpolar and polar. So let's talk about covalent first. So unlike ionic bonds, covalent bonds form when atoms share an electron rather than transferring of electrons. So ionic bonds transfers electrons, and covalent bonds shares an electron, as you can see in this picture here. They share this minus they share this electron. So this type of bond usually forms between atoms that have similar electronegativity, meaning they pull on electrons with roughly equal strength. So you can see on the periodic table how much an element has an electronegativity. So let's talk about nonpolar covalent bonds. So nonpolar covalent bond occurs when electrons are shared equally between the atoms. So the electrons are evenly distributed, so it has no partial charges, which makes the molecule nonpolar. So when we say nonpolar, no positive or negative end. So a common example of a nonpolar covalent bonding is found in this. This is oxygen gas. This is carbon dioxide. So they are example of nonpolar covalent bonds. So in biology, nonpolar covalent bonds are important in lipids such as triglycerides and fatty acids. So these molecules are hydrophobic, meaning they are scared of water. Hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fear of water. So meaning nonpolar covalent bonds does not mix well with water, and this property is crucial for the structure of the cell membrane. So in our cell membrane, we have what we call phospholipids that keeps our cell intact. Also used for energy storage, for protection and insulation. So remember that nonpolar covalent bonds result in molecules that do not dissolve easily in water, which strongly influences how they function in the body. Since we have nonpolar, we also have polar covalent bonds, which are very important in anatomy and physiology. So a polar covalent bond still is involves sharing the electrons, but the sharing is unequal. So covalent bonds still sharing of electrons, but the difference of the polar covalent bonds is unequal, and nonpolar covalent bonds are equal. So this unequal sharing occurs because one atom is more electronegative, meaning that it pulls electrons closer to itself. So which as a result, we have a weakly negative side here and a weakly positive side here. So this is the water molecule. So we have a partial negative, a partial positive. That's why they are not balanced, unlike the last one. So the most important example of polar covalent bonds is water. So in a water molecule, oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen. So oxygen pulls the shared electrons closer. Then oxygen, since it tends to have a negative charge, it develops a partial negative charge. And since hydrogen typically has a positive charge, it develops a partial positive charge, which makes this uneven distribution of charge, which makes water a polar molecule. So polarity is very important because it allows water to dissolve ionic compounds. It can dissolve salt, for example. It can also interact with other polar molecules, and they participate in chemical reactions, which is very important here. And they form hydrogen bonds. And most biological molecules that contains polar covalent bonds are proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. So without polar covalent bonding, the chemistry of life simply would not function. So since we talk about these polar bonds, polar covalent bonds, let's talk about hydrogen bonds. This is the last type of bonding. So hydrogen bonds are the weakest but the most important bonds. A hydrogen bond is not a true chemical bond like ionic or covalent, but instead it is a weak electrical attraction. So hydrogen bonds occur when a hydrogen atom is already involved in a polar covalent bond and is attracted to a slightly negative atom nearby, such as hydrogen and oxygen. So this is different. This is a water molecule. This is another water molecule. This is not a hydrogen bond because they are in a single molecule, but instead, just like what we talk here, this is a covalent bond. But since when it interacts with another water molecule, as I said, hydrogen tends to have a positive charge and oxygen tends to have a negative, so they have a little weak kind of interaction, what we call as the H bond or hydrogen bond. So slightly positive hydrogen of one molecule, slightly negative oxygen on another molecule, and indeed individually hydrogen bonds are very weak, but collectively when there's a lot of hydrogen bonds, they are very powerful. Hydrogen bonding is essential for holding water molecules together, or what we call as cohesion, and it gives water a high heat capacity and it stabilizes protein shapes. It also holds DNA strands together and maintains the structure of enzymes. So as you can see, these dotted lines here are what we call the hydrogen bonds. So the most important biological examples here is DNA, as DNA are held together by hydrogen bonds between their complementary bases. So that's it for this lesson. Next lesson, just a heads up, we will talk about chemical reactions. So that's it for this lesson about chemical bonds, and I hope you understand something here. Thank you for watching.